tonight we've got a great opportunity to really dive into observational skills and how we can better observe and notice things that will help us make better decisions, both for player development opportunities and our practice design. Our guest tonight will share a real wealth of knowledge and experiences. However, ultimately, this webinar is all about you as a coach. So throughout the next hour and a half, I would really like you to just absorb the information, but more importantly, keep thinking about how it might relate to you and where you're currently at in your coaching journey, along with the environment and players that you work with. Okay, looking at our objectives tonight. So 3 main objectives and areas that we're going to focus on. First of all, the planning stage, where we look at how you can plan your sessions in a way that's both challenging and realistic for your players, but also provide you with a real clear focus for observation. We'll then move on to the delivery stage, where we'll look at how you can better observe as the session is running, before finally moving on to the review stage. This is where we'll look at how we can better reflect and review in such a time-restricted environment. On screen now, you'll see our definition. So this is what we've come up with as our definition for observation at the FA. And I think before we delve into it, it's really important that we understand this so we know what we're looking at this evening.
For me, I'd probably go with 3 things to really drill down for tonight. So one would be, how open-minded we are regarding our observations. 2, how do those observations inform our decisions? Sometimes they're negative or a positive pull on our behaviours. And then 3, that real clarity of focus is important for me. So that's probably my sort of like interpretation there, Dan.
So how can we avoid that chaos, or how can we manage that chaos a little bit, and how can we have real clarity and focus on what we're wanting to work on? So I think there's 3 things here in terms of that clarity and focus. The first one is around the session aims, which again might be for 3 or 4 sessions, not just one. So you might have things running for a period. On how the players are going to work towards or achieve those aims that you're hoping for them to work on. And is there alignment between what you're wanting the players to learn, so what you're going to be observing and noticing, and is there alignment to the actual practices and games and activities that you've got them doing? So is it actually allowing the players to do what you want them to do by the practice or the design of the practice that you've got in place? So yeah, from a planning perspective, I think that's where it's crucial that we get that right, because otherwise, are we trying to coach everything and do we end up coaching nothing? Are we trying to observe everything and we end up observing nothing? It's just having real clarity and focus around what we're going after, really, and being really explicit and sharing that with the players and doing it as we go, not saving it up to the end.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I think good evening, everyone. I think Brams has touched on a really good point there around observing and trying to observe absolutely everything and maybe not coming out with your outcome, or trying to be really specific on one thing and missing something bigger in the picture. And also around what he stated there with letting your players know what the aims are of your session. So you may actually have players who are actually in on what's being observed in the session, and the player might pick up on something that they're observing because you've shared the aims with them. So I think there's some real golden nuggets there with what Brams has just said in that short piece.
And also it's quite important sometimes to look at those unintentional things that happen. So actually they become your big juicy moments where you go, tell you what, we were going after this, but actually I've seen this here, and that's really intrigued me. And that's where sometimes as a coach you can interrogate why things have happened in the way that they have done. So it's a bit like, love this, clarity for players. I've got clarity, they've got clarity. This is what I want you to learn. This is what I want you to do. We're going after that. But then also don't forget those unintentional things around, well, actually, this has happened and I'm not really sure why. And it might be that dialogue that opens up between you and the player a little bit around, well, actually, why did you do that? Why did this happen in the way that it did? And that interrogation piece, sometimes born out of reflection, really helps us in terms of, thinking about observation and noticing and where we go next with things.
Yeah. And I think the key thing that we're saying here is that by planning your observations, by really being clear on what you're going to go after, it should make your job easier on a match day or on a session, because you're very clear in your mind of what you're going after. You would hope then it leads to a little bit less distraction as well.
Yeah, and it's difficult. It's a difficult one to do because you can find yourself going down rabbit holes or getting drawn into areas where you didn't want to go, and sometimes you've just got to step back and just say, right, what am I doing here? What's my focus? And just park some things for another day.
Yeah, it might even be a good idea to write them down as well, so you can keep referring to them throughout your session.
Yeah.
But
for me personally, I'd have them on a whiteboard, and that's as much for me as it is the players. Mm-hmm. It helps me keep my focus on it.
And it just got me thinking, probably one more for you, Brams. How does it change if you're going to work with a group for the first time, or if you're maybe coaching in schools, for example, where you're going to work with a new group? How does your observational planning differ for that compared to when you know the group already?
Yeah, I guess it comes down to your priorities and why you're there. So I guess with a new group, for me, it'd be my priorities would be around using from an observation and noticing perspective to keep things on topic this evening would be to trying to get to know the players or the pupils if it's in a school environment. You know, what makes them tick, who are they, what are they about, what switches them on, what works, what doesn't work. It'd be very much that exploratory sessions around getting to know them, because if I don't know them, where do you go with your planning? It's a difficult one. So that sort of builds over time. So if it's a brand new one, I'd guess from my perspective, the priorities would be around how can I get to know the players as best and as quickly as I can, so I can then start to observe and notice other things around their development within the game or within training.
Yeah, I think we can go straight into it. So I think what we've like to do here with this video, so this is a practice that I delivered with some brand new players, which I know Brams and Wobbs mentioned earlier, around how might you plan for working with new players and what might go into that planning. So for me, my aim going into this practice was to try and get the players to understand the rules of the practice, because I knew it would be something new for them. And then what might I observe them doing well? What might I need to notice to then support the players to be better at the practice? So what I've done is I've just got a few timestamps here that I'm going to show you. And in these timestamps, I'm going to be able to share some information around what I was actually looking at and what actually happened. Since I was actually looking at it, and with my co-colleague here, Sarah, who you can hear in the video, I was too focused on actually trying to get the players to learn the rules without actually observing that they weren't following what was happening in the practice. So when a team is in possession of the ball, someone on the opposition had to drop onto the yellow line, which you can see on your screen. And this wasn't taking place. So I've actually missed this. So as I was really focused on trying to make sure that the practice was going to work, I've missed, through my observation being too narrow, actually the practice rules itself.
Focusing on what we said earlier around less is more, and having that attentional focus and that clarity over what you're going after, it's not about ignoring everything else, because you need your session to work, and if they haven't got the rules, that could prevent your session aims coming out. So I guess there's some logistical things that are sort of givens that you're going to need to organise and ensure that are working before you can get into the observation piece around what you're wanting to learn and do. So yeah, it's not forget everything else. This is what I'm learning, so I'm not going to focus on that. It's having, I guess, that common sense approach that, and a realization that actually I've missed that out. I need to reset this and go again and explain the rules and then go from there. You know,
I think sometimes we've got to think about, like, are we observing players or are we observing the practice? So sometimes that's quite an important decision I think we make. Some people might say we do both, but in this instance there, you know, it might be that we're looking at just the practice. You know, do they understand the practice? Are they clear with it? Are they understanding areas? Are they understanding the tasks that I've tried to get them to try and carry out and act? You know, what's my language been like? You know, they've not really got that yet. So do I need to halt it? Has everybody got it, or not just a few? Or is there a couple really struggling? Or can I get somebody else to come and have a little chat with them and explain it to them? Or somebody's arrived late tonight and then they've not got it. So I think sometimes in that first instance, you know, for me, it's about a big decision to say, am I observing players or am I observing the practice? And that's not a bad start point sometimes to say, especially if I'm introducing a new practice. It might just be, well, actually, fundamentally, is this right? Area size right? Space is right? I've matched these numbers up, but actually, does it need to go underloaded? Does it go to need overloaded? Just starting to really frame some stuff around practice, but then the players ultimately are underperforming there, don't they? So I think it's just a good decision.
And just to build on that, I guess I think when I'm starting a practice, my assumption is the players won't all get it. So I'm going to need to spend a few minutes explaining to a few, showing a few, recapping on it. That's my expectation, because I might have it on my session plan and it makes perfect sense in my head, but actually it might not to the players, or it might not even work. So I need to tweak it or change it. So I think I always go in with that assumption that the players won't get it straight away. So I guess my observation and noting around what I'm after is secondary at that point, to actually just letting them have some free play and get used to the game, and then we can start doing some work.
Just here, so I asked the players to then try and stay on the line, but the minute they regain possession and they turn into transition, which is a part of the game as we know it, they forget to have to go back onto the line. So it's about then reinforcing information that happens. Now, what you'll see happening in the video now is Sarah starts to co-coach with me, so she can see the practice from a different angle. And this starts to change what happens with the return. So I just wanted to ask the guys again. So what are some of the benefits maybe of having someone else co-coach with you, and also about where they may stand?
In terms of observational strategy stuff, the benefit there, I think if you're working as a dual, so you might have some people on the call on here that are privileged to work with another person. Some people might have to do everything. Some people might have more than a few pairs of hands. They might have some helpers, people who've just gone through the Playmaker recently, or just started to get into coaching, or just started to step over onto the sidelines and get involved. It might be that you really start to think about adopting different coaching positions. So, and then also you can start to maybe provide and assign some roles in terms of what you might look at. So what I mean by that is one, adopting different positions, because then you start to see a number of different things, but then assign roles in terms of those particular people. So, how do you get yourself into a position where, you might say, well, actually, you're going to start to look at this. And I think sometimes that also comes when you've got multiple eyes. What are you actually looking at? So are we following the person on the ball? Or are we into a position where we might look at, well, actually, I'm going to start to look at some wider things. So just in terms of observation, I'll just throw this one in here, Nim, to try and complement. You're working with Sarah there. Probably I quite like two analogies here. One's around RoboCop and one's around lifeguard. So sometimes a RoboCop locks in on a player, gets the little detail, and the log comes up and they're zooming in on that player, looking at their on and off the ball skills, and they follow the person with the ball around and then move. Once it's passed, they follow that person. Whereas a lifeguard is quite good from an observational perspective to, if we think about a lifeguard, they observe the area, they're looking for danger, they're looking for anomalies, they're looking for little spots, little things where they might go, actually, yeah, I'm going to log that and I might think about that when I've seen it happen again. Right, now's a chance to go. So, that RoboCop versus lifeguard piece is quite interesting, just in terms of how you might help each other. So for me, adopting different positions, maybe assigning roles, and just throwing in that little piece around RoboCop and lifeguard in terms of our observational strategies on the ball versus starting to look at some other stuff away from the ball, and just as a pair, really.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And I think you've just mentioned, especially for everyone listening, assigning roles is such a great way, because you may have someone coaching with you. You may have, I go out to watch my nephew and there's 3 or 4 coaches working with a team. But if they haven't got an assigned role, they may all be looking at the exact same thing, or they might see the same problem, but not see other parts of the session. So it might be like what Welbs has just said. It might be that my overview is I'll manage the practice and I'll look at the rules. And Sarah in here, I might have said to her, Sarah, could you do some of the individual coaching and have a look at some of the individuals within the practice, taking the burden away from one coach trying to do absolutely everything, and actually sharing the roles to ultimately have a better experience for the players. Now, I've just got one more clip. So if you can see now in the video, I've actually moved position. So I started off near the fence and I've come over here because I realized, right, I might stand over here because I've observed something. I'm going to try and reinforce the rules. Now, as I reinforced the rules here, I was able to give some one-to-one information. So I've actually noticed by changing my position and moving around somewhere else in the practice, I can support the player's development to here. You'll see the player in the white bib that's actually standing on the line. Now, because it's taken me a while in this practice to get the players to understand the rules, what I would do now is actually give some coaching points to this player around what can they do on that line. So how can they actually support? How can they try to intercept and move their body to win the ball back? And I was here really focused around thinking, right, I've got the player to now stand on the line. So in our plan, so going back to what Bram said in terms of our planning and trying to really get that right. And these are the 3 things I want to go after. Now I've got a little bit of clarity around supporting the players with the rules. It's now going to give me a baseline to support the players with actually learning some skills within the game.
Yeah, I think there's a big piece here as well around, how long do you spend just stepping back? Are you comfortable setting your session up, and are you comfortable just to step back and observe for 2-3 minutes, see how the session's going, not get involved in the emotions and caught up with too much of the chaos that's going on? Because let's face it, the game is chaos. It's how we can make sense of that. But being able to actually take a step back and observe that and not act on it straight away, I think is such a big thing, especially if you have the luxury of having another coach alongside you who can support. And definitely one person look at one thing, so it might be how the session's running, whereas another person is looking at it from a player development point of view, watching certain players. But I think it's really important that we're clear on that from the start. And certainly I've been guilty of it, is as soon as the session starts, you're in it. And sometimes you feel as a coach, you have to be in the thick of the action. But, how comfortable can you be just taking a step back, let the players figure it out? And that's another big point, is what do you do with these observations? And we've seen quite a few comments in the chat box this evening about timing. So when do you step in and give across information? But equally, when do you just let the players figure it out themselves? Because ultimately, we want the practice to be as realistic as possible, but appropriately challenging for the players. So is there anything there that somebody would like to pick up on how long do we leave it for players to figure it out themselves?
Dan, I think it's a great point. Something I'll just throw in is from an observation thing in terms of, when we're observing, we see, I'm going to keep this quite simple. When we're observing, we see players do things really well, and we see sometimes where people might need a little bit of support. And sometimes, as a bit of a rule of thumb that I've tended to use now over that period of time, is to maybe use a little bit of a 1, 2, 3 in my mind in terms of when do my interventions or what do I need to do based on what I see. So what I mean by that is once is a one-off, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is a pattern. So if once is a one-off, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is a pattern, well, actually, 3 times is a pattern could be something where it might be Nim working with that player who's on the line, and I've seen three things now where actually I might need to go in and support that player with an intervention. It might be a little drive-by where I provide a little bit of detail. It might be that I have to stop it. It might be that I have to question to try and unpick their understanding. It might be that I have to provide some feedback. But then also the other way, it's quite it's good for us to recognise player strength and they're making in-game decisions really well. So it might be once is a one-off, twice a coincidence, 3 times a pattern. You've done this really well 3 times now. That's 3 great examples, and I've got to go in there and reward that. And it might even be that I stop the session there and I actually reward that best practice so that people can see it.
Just to add in there around there. So again, like you said, some great information, and someone gave me a great piece of advice. So if I'm working with a group of players and I'm, for example, it may be the topic on playing out, I need to probably stand somewhere where I can see them doing what part of that practice is. So it might be that I stand behind the goal or near one of the defenders. And I know Marion Hayton's just put in on the chat that she likes to stand in the practice so she can see and give one-to-one feedback. And that's another great way of doing it. So it may be just standing in the appropriate part of the pitch of where you're working.
And sometimes it'll take you a little bit of figuring out. So it might take you to move around a little bit in the first couple of times you put on a session until you find, the right position for what you're trying to achieve.
I wanted to just add in there, Welbs, around actually what are you observing when you're recording something. So I bought myself a camera footage to record some of my uni games, and I was watching it back and thinking, right, what do I actually need to help the players with here? How much of it can I actually condense? And you don't want to give them absolutely everything. And I found myself doing the opposite. So I was telling them to watch the whole game. Can you give me some feedback? But what I really needed to do was to give them maybe a segment, or what happened in this moment? Can you explain it to your peers? Can you explain it to your teammates? What's the benefit of doing that? And going back to what Welbs has said, and a lot of people in the chat have said, we may not have access to video. What might we observe? A tactics board or a tally chart on what players are doing, and then providing that information to inform our observations.
Yeah. Well, one thing we touched on earlier as well is being really clear about what success looks like. So when we're observing, we need to know what success looks like. And I think the use of video analysis for one, but just video in general can really help us with this. So, I mean, role models, everybody watches football. Everybody has role models in some capacity. So I would just encourage people to watch the game, and us as coaches as well. The more games we watch, the better our knowledge of the game becomes, the easier it then becomes to observe certain things.